Hi, I'm Kevin Glass, managing editor of townhall.com, and I am here today on Blogging Heads with
David Freddoso of conservativeintel.com.
Great. Well, thanks for joining me today, David. I thought we could go through a couple subjects in the news, and particularly the Boston bombings, which obviously have been discussed infinitum among the punditry at this point. But I thought what would be interesting first to start with is the tension that we've seen among conservatives with regard to how some of the the one surviving suspect is being treated, and kind of how it's flared up what we've seen recently in the tension between civil liberties, kind of this renewed emphasis on civil liberties that some conservatives in Congress have had, and the traditional law and order, national security conservatives, which have been led primarily by Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham and
Right.
Congressman King. Do you think, and I worried, and I was on Blogging Heads a couple weeks ago actually, that the vigor with which conservatives cheered on Rand Paul during his filibuster, which was primarily about civil liberties, would dissipate, and quickly. And do you think that we're seeing some of that right now?
Well, it's possible. When you have a terrorist attack, everybody, a lot of people will change their footing all of a sudden because of this. You could almost say that of George W. Bush and the way that 9/11 altered his outlook on foreign affairs, and he had campaigned on having a humbler foreign policy, and he ended up having one that was very much the opposite, where we ended up in two hot wars and two nation-building missions, which he had specifically also denounced during his 2000 campaign, the very idea of nation-building. So there's always a danger of that. However, I haven't seen too much of a clamor on the right for remilitarizing something or invading somewhere, or this whole business about you remember the David Sirota column that kind of caused all the controversy. Well, I hope the terrorists are white guys because that way we won't invade their country if whoever they end up being. I don't think that is a very well-grounded fear. That it really ever was. We had a bombing. We're going to have a prosecution. We're going to learn more about the motives and the groups that might have been involved if there was one. As far as, but I certainly don't think anyone should be changing their view here. One of the posts that I put up the other day in the middle of this was about the question, because suddenly it seems more relevant that Rand Paul was raising. Should the executive branch, should the government be able to use a drone against a terrorist U.S. citizen in the United States? I mean, here we had a case where that might have applied. And obviously, I think it's pretty obvious that no, the administration doesn't have that power to preemptively assassinate people that we think might plant a bomb or carry out some kind of terror attack. Obviously, we still arrest such people, and the fact that the Obama administration had originally tried to reserve that power to itself was less a question of them actually wanting to use it than it was a question of them being completely unwilling to cede even an inch when it came to what sort of powers do I have as president.
Yeah, I did read that piece that you had, and I thought the hypothetical was interesting. What if the FBI had intelligence that Dzhokhar might have been radicalized, might have been planning something, and we had intel that he was, hiking in Vermont. Could we drone strike him under those parameters? And I think that the answer should be obviously not. You seem maybe a little more confident that the Obama administration would agree with that than I think that I do. But I think that, the public perception aside, I think that the Obama administration might reserve that power even if they wouldn't actually execute
Right. Well, exactly. I mean, because that's what they were doing. They didn't want to give any ground on that. All they would say at first was, well, we wouldn't, why would we ever do that? Well, that's not an answer. I mean, the correct answer is that we have a Fifth Amendment, and you can't deprive people of their life without due process. And sure, yeah, I don't think there's any disagreement anywhere that if a terrorist has his hand on the plunger and he's about to blow up a building full of people, you can use whatever, including drones, you can use whatever means you have to take him out or stop him. But that's not the issue. The issue is preemptive assassinations like the ones we're carrying out right now in Yemen and Pakistan.
Now, the other interesting issue that obviously, well, not obviously, but if you've been following Twitter, you've seen Senator John McCain and Senator Lindsey Graham kind of really enthusiastically, immediately in the wake of Djohar's apprehension, saying, we shouldn't follow standard criminal protocol here. We should treat him as an enemy combatant. We need to interrogate him to kind of get any more intelligence if there were any more attacks. Obviously, they had bombs. They might have planted something somewhere. Now, that kind of runs contrary to the Paul, Amash, Lee kind of, we do need to respect the rights of American citizens, because Dzhokhar was an American citizen and he did obviously commit a criminal act.
Right.
And I'm not sure, I haven't seen a whole lot of conservative pushback against the Graham-McCain kind of view here that I might have expected. And, we saw even Senator Paul talking pretty stringently about, things we have to do in the wake of this attack.
Right. Well, it would be irresponsible for law enforcement not to ask some basic things. One of the things that's been brought up here is this public safety exception to the Miranda, the rules surrounding the Miranda warning. And it's basically a simple matter of, okay, if you catch somebody who's, he set off a bomb, it's worth asking him whether there are more bombs because, more people might get blown up. And it's, but the main thing about that public safety exception is that it's only a rule about when you can actually use that against him in court. And it's important to remember that. You can ask a criminal suspect anything you want. It's just that if you don't Mirandize him and let him lawyer up, you might find out the evidence gets excluded in court later. In this case, I think it's pretty easy because the case practically makes itself. They don't really need a confession from Dzhokhar in order to in order to get a criminal prosecution. Probably they shouldn't have any problems with that. So you could really ask him anything you want, but in that one case, as to whether there's an actual continued threat, you would still be able to use something like that. If he said, yeah, I planted 3 more bombs and this is where they are, you could use that against him. But it's a pretty narrow issue, really. It doesn't make a lot of sense to start doing crazy stuff like we're going to hold him as an enemy combatant, and I mean, that seems like a solution in search of a problem, really. We're going to be able to prosecute him in the normal channels, and really it shouldn't even be controversial in the least, but if we're going to discuss this business of what do we use this enemy combatant status for, generally we use it to hold people without any trial indefinitely, which is something the Obama administration has not done anything about. All of the symbolic moral preening over closing Guantanamo is kind of futile, because if we're just going to keep holding people without trial, why is it morally superior to do that in the United States instead of in Guantanamo? I mean, it's not. It's kind of it's nothing. It's completely insubstantial show of high-mindedness that doesn't actually rise to the level of high-mindedness or respect for the rule of law.
Right. And I think that some of what we've seen, kind of the reactions from politicians, are almost more signaling than anything else. We want, or John McCain might want to signal that he's a tough guy and he doesn't want to treat terrorists with kid gloves, and
right.
And beyond that, there aren't actually a whole lot of policy implications here. It's more that kind of they want to show the world that they're tough, and to a certain extent, the Obama administration might be doing the same thing. You know, they did make a point not to Mirandize him until I think it was yesterday. We're filming this on Tuesday, and I think it was yesterday that his Miranda warnings were read, and now he'll go into the standard kind of criminal justice court system. But it appeared, and obviously we're not privy to some of the discussions or any of the interrogations. It appeared that there was no further threat beyond the initial attack and then the kind of weaponized rampage that occurred Thursday night, Friday morning.
Right. Yeah. No. That's right. And again, it's kind of. I think you described it very accurately. That this is kind of political posturing, or you could say sort of posturing for the terrorists to show them we're tough. Whatever. I think we've shown that we're sufficiently tough by the way that I'm not a fan of the Iraq War and did not support it. But if you could certainly point that out as an example of if we're determined to come and get you, we're going to. So I don't think that we need to show the world that we're particularly tough. And I really don't think that holding people indefinitely without trial is a good way of showing we're tough either.
Yeah, I think certainly some of what we're learning is that Tamerlan, the older brother, kind of made statements along the lines of, bombings like this happen kind of regularly in some of these war-torn countries, and that Americans don't really grasp the seriousness of, obviously, the global terror problem, but the global poverty problem, the global violence problem. And I actually do maybe think that an overreaction to, obviously, what they did would have kind of proven that. We're not used to regular bombings, or even those that don't have particularly high body counts, at least as of this recording, and that that kind of would enforce. And we've heard from the parents of the Tsarnaevs, and they're kind of a lot skeptical of government authority, both Russian government authority and American government authority, claiming they've been set up. You can't believe the story that the government tells you, and I think that
been reading too much InfoWars, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and kind of a U.S. government overreaction might enforce that perception around the world.
That's true. People are going to believe what they want to believe, though. It's. I mean, you can't do much. There's not much material to work with if you're dealing with conspiracy theorists, especially ones with crazy ideas like that. I mean, in fact, I think that the father at one point said that if they ended up killing Dzhokhar before he was caught, if they ended up killing him, that it would be more proof that he'd been set up. And I mean, it's just crazy talk. There's no anyone who has fallen for that kind of Alex Jones world. I'm afraid that it's very difficult to come back, because everything is a conspiracy once you believe in conspiracy theories.
Right. The other thing that interested me about this was, as it was unfolding, you mentioned the David Sirota column on "I Hope They're White Guys," and both sides kind of rooting for the perpetrators to be their preferred antagonist group, which seems. Maybe it's just Twitter and this rapid reaction media environment that we're in, but it seems unprecedented that we have people kind of hoping that their preconceived narrative about a terrorist attack like this is going to get confirmed.
I think it's really one of the uglier, the fact that the conversation even has to be had is just really stupid and ridiculous, frankly. On the one side, you have, I think, kind of a false concern among... I mean, it's not entirely false. There were confirmed incidents of violence after 9/11 against people who were Muslim, or that people just thought were Muslim. You remember that there was a Sikh in Arizona who was killed on the false presupposition that he was Muslim. But it's pretty, I think that generally those fears are exaggerated, and that that most people are fair-minded enough to recognize that, no, not all Muslims are terrorists or have even the slightest sympathy. There are some who are, and in Elizabethan England, my co-religionists, Catholics, were planting bombs as well. We all have heard of Guy Fawkes, but there were several other famous plots that were foiled or succeeded during those years, and and there were also Catholics who were loyal to the crown, who were often the source of information that led to those plots being foiled. I mean, you can't just, assume the worst about how people are going to react to the news that it's a Muslim. So you have that kind of overblown concern, I think, on the one hand. But then on the other, you have conservatives who are especially sensitive to this, because it seems like we get blamed every time there's some kind of incident. And yes, sometimes there have been people who, pursuing right-wing political aims have committed violence. I mean, people remember Eric Rudolph, who bombed abortion clinics and then the Olympics. There are things out there. There are incidents like that, and there's left-wing violence as well. There's the Unabomber, although he doesn't fit completely into the left-wing box. But you've had the Occubombers, those jokers who thought they were trying to bomb a bridge. You get those sorts of things. They happen, and people look to them as vindication of their own worldview, because your guys are trying to blow stuff up and kill people. Well, it's kind of something that happens on all sides. There are a lot of people on the left, though, who are especially smug about this and seem to think that on the right, people are especially prone to violence, or because conservatives own more guns, they're more likely to do stuff like this. The actual incidence of political violence is, in this country especially, it's pretty low when you consider how well armed we are and how much political violence there is in other countries. And it's also, I think, useful to remember that any nut can, the reason we have these kinds of violent attacks and terrorism generally is that you've got weak-minded people who want to be something, but their only way of being something is to cause a lot of damage and win notoriety that way. And so they embrace some kind of, at least I believe, embrace some kind of idea, whether it's a legitimate one or not, and use it as a justification for doing something like this. So the fact that someone commits violence in the name of anarchy or the Enlightenment, I mean, is the French Revolution evidence that the entire Enlightenment project should be discarded and we should go back to the 14th century? Probably not. I don't think that's a very strong argument for it anyway, even if you wanted to go back there. So liberals want to say it's conservatives from the get-go. So conservatives are really sensitive about this, and they really want to, they really want it not to be so. And everybody's just, hey, why don't we just calm down and stop the collective blame game here? We shouldn't collectively blame people for terrorism unless they're actually helping with it or assisting it in some way on purpose. And stop using it as a crutch to argue your point. Just sort of throwing out careless accusations that, the right-wingers are just, the bodies are piling up from all of the right-wing violence in this country. Well, that's kind of an argument out there looking for evidence, and it's not a particularly good way of arguing in good faith if you believe in your ideas.
Yeah, and it looks like, and this is just, obviously this has been changing almost daily, but it looks like the Tsarnaevs don't really fit into either of the boxes that, I would say the boxes that the media has created, right-wing terrorists and Muslim terrorists. And while they obviously were Muslims, they seem to be more affected by their experience as immigrants to the United States. At least the older brother, who right now it looks like was kind of the driving force behind the plot. They they had trouble fitting in. They had trouble assimilating. Tamerlan, the older one, kind of stuck to the small immigrant community that he kind of fell in with when he came here. And while it looks like Tamerlan was radicalized as a Muslim on trips abroad that he took, they're obviously not connected to Al-Qaeda at this point. They're not connected to any other kind of terrorist network. And it seems a problem of assimilation and isolation in the United States rather than a problem of Islamic radicals overseas or inability of law enforcement to get the job done here.
Right. Well, I think it's still sort of hard to say, whether or not he was actually involved with an organization that we identify as a major terrorist organization. This is clearly an act of terrorism that seems at this point to have sprung from his wrong-headed, or I guess whatever you want to say. It sprung from his Islamic radicalization. That this was an act that was supposed to somehow promote jihad or something along those lines. But yeah, I mean, clearly these guys were pretty normal at one point, and they were Muslims all along. So there was some kind of radicalization that occurred. I mean, it's sort of not enough, I think, almost just to say it's Islam. Like, where did this go wrong? Because they really, you look at their social media accounts, and you can see with the older brother that there's you can sort of see the radicalization happening. You look at the younger brother, and you just think, he's tweeting about doing laundry in his dorm room, and using all kinds of profanities. It's the sort of Twitter thing that you might see your little brother doing somewhere. So it is hard to say. I mean, obviously it seems like we're probably going to find out that it's Islam related. And if that's the thing that drove these guys, then and they're not, in fact, connected to some kind of international Islamic terror conspiracy. In a way, that's comforting, because it means that Al-Qaeda hadn't infiltrated that far. But in a way, it's kind of scary, because you have to wonder, like, how easily can someone who seems like a really normal guy be radicalized that way?
I suppose it would be comforting, that they're not connected to an international terror network. But it seems like that's been the pattern post 9/11, is that we haven't had any Al-Qaeda fueled or other terror network fueled attacks on American soil. It's been more lone wolf types. We had the guy who drove a plane into the IRS building. We had the Beltway snipers. We had the Fort Hood shootings. These aren't international terror networks that are driving these. They are kind of these unhinged individual acts.
Right. Although the Fort Hood shooter at least had some connection to Anwar al-Awlaki, so
yes, that's true. That's
true. It's a loose connection. It's more a connection of somebody persuading someone to do something like that. But yeah, you're right. In a lot of these cases, even when it's Islamic terrorism, it's not necessarily directly connected to any group that you or I would have ever heard of just reading the news every day. And yeah, it is sort of scary that can happen, but like mass shootings, it's something that's rare, and that it seems that you see them thwarted more often than you see them succeed, like with the Times Square bombing, the underwear bomber, the shoe bomber, etc. And for purposes of enforcement and sort of trying to prevent these things in the future, it does matter whether it's an international, linked to some international group, or whether it isn't. But as far as the damage that somebody can do, it's obviously exactly the same.
That's true. Now, one of the other topics I wanted to kind of hit on with you, obviously this ties a little bit into the Tsarnaevs is our immigration debate. Well, ties in or doesn't tie in, but we've had some Republicans on Capitol Hill saying that the Boston bombings do have important implications for our current immigration debate, and that we need to kind of slow the process down and see what needs to be done with our immigration system in reaction to other potential Tsarnaevs. You know, they were political refugees from Chechnya who were granted asylum in the United States, and both had legal status. Dzhokhar had citizenship, and Tamerlan was trying to get citizenship.
Right.
To me, it seems like, again, a little bit of political posturing, because it seems hard to be able to say, there are political immigrants who we need to crack down on and let fewer of them into the country from certain war-torn areas, I suppose. But that seems a little inhumanitarian, which is kind of outside of the bounds of the current immigration debate that we're having now.
Right. Less Muslims, more Mexicans, something like that, right? That people would... I think that it's a totally unrelated issue, and in fact that, the way that this immigration bill is being handled, which is the comprehensive method, I think it really screws this up and gives you an opportunity to demagogue this that wouldn't be there otherwise. I mean, there's no... the entire naturalization process and the gaining of just some kind of legal status are two things that we've decided we have to tackle at the same time in immigration reform, and we really don't. I mean, how many millions of people are there out there who'd love to immigrate to the United States, and they can't even get a visa here because our government's convinced that they're going to slip away into the population. And at the same time, we're naturalizing people, or letting people like Tamerlan go through the process, even though he had this domestic violence rap on his record. It's kind of in many ways our immigration system and naturalization system. It seems really arbitrary, and it would make a lot more sense in the immigration debate if we would start treating some of these issues separately. I think it's something we can afford to do now that we couldn't have afforded to do back in 2007. I have a post up about this today at Conservative Intel. If you look back at 2007, you had a lot of people saying, oh, let's deal with border security and immigration separately, which was really something that would have caused immigration reform to go down in flames because there wasn't sufficient support for it. Today, that's changed a lot. I think that on the right, you've had people really, either for reasons of political expediency or out of genuine conversion or because they were there all along, the sort of Wall Street Journal, Chamber of Commerce wing of the Republican Party or the conservative movement. You have enough support on the right now that immigration reform can happen. Just the question is, do you have to tie it to border security, which in my opinion, I'm for immigration reform, but border security is important enough that we shouldn't have to tie the two together to get either one. You shouldn't be holding the one hostage for the other. And the same could be said of legalization, which is absolutely necessary, tying that to a debate over naturalization, which isn't the least bit urgent. I mean, here you have, in terms of regularizing the status of people, you have you have families that are being split up. You have people who are at least in threat of deportation, at least theoretically, who've never actually known any home country but this one. And and are we going to sink this whole thing in a debate over naturalizing people and giving them a path to citizenship? I mean, I think we can come back in a few years and probably the path to citizenship is going to be more attainable later on. But we should start by, there are 11 million people in this country right now who can't legally drive a car because they can't get a driver's license. And it's a big problem. I mean, there are really basic things that you and I take for granted as legal residents and citizens of the United States that somebody who's here illegally and works a job, works hard, etc. They just can't do. it's a lot harder to function in that situation, and it definitely creates a drag on our economy. I mean, you can't really start a business if you are in a position where you can't even drive a car without breaking the law. It's some people will say, well, but we don't want people to they're going to drag down wages and blah blah. Well, they're already here and they are dragging down wages if they drag them down. So any negative economic effects of having such a large illegal labor pool already exist. So it's not as though you're making it worse by simply granting legal status so that people can kind of function as ordinary members of society. But then, when you start talking about citizenship, it's sort of like, look, when you've got people like, you've got Sean Hannity and very conservative members of Congress all basically doing a 180 on the question of, quote, amnesty, which I suppose we could say legalization is a form of that. If they're going to come that far, just cash in your victory. When you're winning at gambling, you're supposed to stop and then cash in your winnings, and you can come back later if you want to try to bet some more. But it would be a big mistake to let that screw up the whole deal. It would be very a very negative development for people who really just want to live in the light of day, and probably the majority of whom could care less about whether they're going to have a U.S. passport.
Now, I'm going to take a little bit of a contrarian stance there. I think that conservatives have a good point to be concerned about border security, because, I think that border security is a worthy goal, and I think right now we're clearly not even close to having a secure border. I do think that it's important to kind of tie the two together, even just symbolically, to say, we are legalizing the people who are here, but we are getting really serious about letting more people in. And I do think that the amnesty provisions, or the path to legalization, or whatever you want to call it, has at least a marginal incentive effect on immigration. And the waves that we've seen, even if it's not 100% driven, an immigrant who's weighing the costs and benefits of immigrating to the United States illegally, breaking laws, the amnesty probably doesn't have an effect on the average person. But for someone who sees a relative who's gone, or sees friends who have gone, and they get here and they do get a path to legalization, I think that might have a marginal effect on future immigration levels. Not that it's hugely important.
It's possible, but one thing that's happening right now, and that's been happening over the last few years, is that Mexico's economy has been improving and ours has been deteriorating. And the result, at one point there was net negative immigration going on between here and there, or at least some people said. I don't know if that's 100% true, but certainly we're not seeing anything like the levels we had before. And you're absolutely right about the possibility that you're creating a marginal an incentive at the margins here. But another thing to keep in mind, I think, is that the enormous incentive that once existed when there was no work there and there's work here, that's really changing. And I think that that's going to change. People talk as if, well, by the current trend, the entire country of Mexico is going to be here by the year whatever. Well, those trends change because economies grow, and it's not the dream of every Mexican to be an American. I spent some time down in Morelos a couple times. Went down there to do service projects, and what you noticed right away is that there's some pretty bad cases of poverty there. But then you see that, okay, you've got kind of the mud hut house here of the guy who is a drunk, and then next door you have this very nicely built up house that you or I would happily live in, and that's the family where a couple of the kids went up to the States and earned a lot of money and sent it back to their parents, or where the father went and sent it back to his wife. and then you go to the Western Union there on the right day, and you see all of the women lined up. Just like I suppose if you're in Los Angeles, you might see a lot of the men lined up to wire money home. That kind of thing is, it's not something that's going to go on forever, because at some point their economy gets better to the point where the marginal incentive to come to the States and work and send money home, it's not necessary anymore. I mean, most of these folks, if they could just be with their families all the time, and if there was work there, they would do it. Right. And so that's. I think that those incentives probably matter more than the question of citizenship in the end.
I think that's absolutely right. That as Mexico's economy gets better, becomes less of a third world country, more of a second world or first world country, the incentive to come to the United States, the largest incentive, obviously, is economic, will largely dissipate. Now, but we could also say that, as you mentioned, in the past few years, at some points people have theorized that there's been a net negative migration from Mexico to the United States. That is largely an effect, and falling immigration is largely an effect of our own kind of disastrous economy over the last few years. And as we return to trend line, immigration will return to trend line.
Well, I would just say that this is kind of like an interlude that's letting them catch up a little bit more, and that sure, we'll go back, I hope, to being prosperous at some point and creating a lot of jobs.
Fingers crossed.
They're going to catch up. Third world economies grow with they have this. They post the kind of GDP percentage growth that a typical even a very healthy first world economy can't match, just because we're so big already, and they're coming up from nothing. And so hopefully you end up with something that's a situation where they are prosperous enough and catching up with us enough that and they will skip generations of things that were very difficult for us. The whole idea, the fact that cell phones are so popular outside of and were always more popular outside of the United States until recently, reflects the lack of infrastructure. But that basically made up for not having the same kind of painstakingly introduced phone infrastructure that went to every house. Well, you could just get a cell phone, so they're able to skip generations of technology and do things like that. And hopefully it's really in our interest that Mexico be a very prosperous place, and that that problem will just kind of solve itself over time, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true. What I've been seeing as far as the actual immigration battle goes is that this could get really, really nasty for conservatives. The kind of coalition politics that are at play here, at least through my sources on Capitol Hill, it's getting bad already. And we've seen back and forths between Senator Rubio and Senator Senator Sessions, and their press people. And I've had other sources who are basically dreading this fight for the Republican Party on Capitol Hill, principally because they've had influential conservatives like Senator Rubio and like Senator Flake who have joined in this Gang of Eight. So it's not just these people that the grassroots conservatives can dismiss as rhinos or as moderates anymore. It's more of a mainstream movement now, and that's going to really come to a loggerheads in the next few months.
No, that's right, and it's Con Carroll over at the Examiner this morning is pointing out that you've got a lot of the pro-immigration reform folks using a lot of really ugly language and kind of kneecapping other fellow Republicans and conservatives and saying really unnecessary things, sort of suggesting that there's racism involved in that sort of thing. Look, I respect the opinion that a lot of people have that, well, this is just against the law, you're rewarding lawbreaking. I understand that argument. Like that is a valid argument, and a person making that argument is not necessarily a racist for making it. But when you start embracing the tactics of the left, things can get especially ugly. And, we'd all really rather not see that happen at all.
I think that some of the Republicans were hoping that the conservative credibility that was bought with Senator Rubio and Senator Flake on board meant that there wasn't going to be a mainstream Capitol Hill opposition to the reform effort. And I think that obviously has not been the case so far. And that might be why we're seeing some of the nastiness come out so early, because they're frustrated from the get-go that there is going to be opposition to this.
That may well be, but this is honestly one of the joys of watching the House of Representatives over the last 10 years has been seeing its transformation from a top-down kind of Tom DeLay's and then Nancy Pelosi's fiefdom to being a place, and part of this is the earmark ban, and part of it I think is John Boehner's leadership style. It's being a place where you just put something out there and you see if it gets the votes. And, it's as simple as that you're not going to absolutely control the terms of the debate. Say, back when Republicans used to control the House, they would do this in order to prevent President Bush from having to veto anything. You remember that? Yeah. And then, you have a different leadership style now, in part because you can't reward and punish members with earmarks, but you're kind of getting a more open and honest debate. And whatever it is that you're trying to push, whether it's immigration reform or anything else, there's just no need to do this. There should be an opposition. There should always be an opposition. And you should argue against them, and you should persuade people, and you should win the vote. I hate to sound like fine, Congress doesn't always work that way. People have their bills buried in committee because they vote the wrong way on stuff. But especially in the Senate, the system of rewards and punishments was never as elaborate in the Senate as it was in the House. And the idea that senators are going to resort to these kind of tactics just because there is an opposition. How dare you? Fine, there's an opposition. Beat the opposition. If that's what you want to do, beat the opposition. But the best chance, I think, for conservatives to come out of this with something that they would like better is going to be in the House. And it's going to be efforts by people like Raul Labrador of Idaho, who has... he's not just a stooge for business. He has a career and a sort of pedigree that demonstrates that. The fact that he was like the least favorite member of the Idaho legislature of the governor at that time and opposing all forms of crony capitalism, etc. He was also an immigration lawyer, and he's somebody who can come to this from a conservative perspective, convince conservatives at least that, here's how far we want to go. And hopefully you end up seeing the House present something that is a reasonable alternative that conservatives will be a little bit happier with than what's in the Rubio bill. Which, by the way, the Rubio bill isn't the worst thing in the world by any stretch of the imagination. A lot of people, Matt Lewis was writing about this the other day, are impressed with just how much more conservative it is than people expected. But you're always going to have complaints. You're always going to have opposition. You have to, sit down and hash out a bill that, in the end, is going to at least work and deal with the real problem that exists, and without giving away too much to the to whatever sort of whim the president has, or what he feels like he needs to come up with in order to show that he's punished his enemies and rewarded his friends, in order for him to feel good and cement his legacy. I actually think one of the other, after this gun vote last week, one of the other interesting aspects of this debate is that Obama is going to be a lot less relevant than he normally is. And I think that's a good thing for a number of reasons, at least if you're a conservative. He is going to be forced to sign whatever they come up with, I think. I don't think that he can say, I don't like this, it doesn't contain a path to citizenship, so I'm going to veto it. After losing on guns, he needs a victory, and just reforming immigration for Obama is going to be a victory. He may he may feel differently, and he may act differently, but I think he'd be making a big mistake if he did.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, and you saw that kind of back in, I think it was February, when the Gang of Eight stuff was really coming together. President Obama released his own kind of goals for immigration, and
Right.
the senators involved with the Gang of Eight were furious at that because they saw that as kind of as trying to cut their legs out from under them. And whatever you say about President Obama, he's a smart politician, and he knew he had to get out of the way back then. And so he's kind of let the process work out. You know, he has a lot of Democrats in the Senate who are fairly loyal to him and who do share broadly the same priorities that he does. And they're going to get, as much as he wants and can negotiate from without him actually being involved in the negotiation process. I do think it's generally a positive for conservatives that President Obama is not involved, at least publicly. They want to win. They want to kind of lay down a marker that Obama's second term is going to be defined more by Congress than by the executive. And that, like, having a kind of bipartisan but Republican-driven immigration bill that comes out of Congress, I think is what a lot of Republicans and conservatives up on Capitol Hill are hoping comes out of this process. And certainly, obviously, after the immigration proposal makes its way through the Senate and the House gets its hands on it, we might see the bill losing some of what conservatives would be most angry about.
No, yeah, that's exactly right. And again, what you're hoping for here, and conservatives feel every which way about immigration. It's something that we all know well. And what you're hoping for here is a bill that solves a real problem and ends up making society better. And frankly, a lot of Republicans would like this. This has been kind of an albatross. The longer this issue gets kicked down the road, you might notice, the more Republicans get hurt by it. And it would almost be in the Democrats' the best possible thing that could happen for the Democrats would be for complete implosion of the immigration reform effort. But pretty much in any way except for Obama vetoing it would end up getting pinned on the Republicans most likely.
Now, quickly, the last topic I just wanted to hit on is you recently made the jump from the Washington Examiner to Conservative Intelligence, and to me, that combined with the launch of Rare, which is another conservative media startup that just happened. I think their launch was last week. In the Obama era, we've seen an incredible proliferation of conservative publications online. Town Hall at this point is almost a legacy media organization online, and the space to me seems to be becoming a lot more crowded. Why don't you tell me why you made the jump to conservative intel and how you think kind of that fits into the broader conservative media ecosystem right now?
Well, I'm already enjoying the amount that I'm able to write, and I have a weekly newsletter that people can sign up for at conservativeintel.com when they reach the page. And it sort of reminds me of, the old Evans-Novak report that I used to help Robert Novak with, and that's sort of what it's modeled after. And something that looks at races and elections and politics. And then the blog is kind of a little bit less formal. I mean, the newsletter is very, I want it to be very dispassionate and looking at things even when it's ugly and conservatives don't want to see it, looking at things through the sort of eyes that are just very realistic. The blog is a little more informal and kind of, looking at things from a more conservative perspective. But is the space crowded? Maybe it is. At the same time, I'm not sure that, given the way things work, in the media world, I'm not sure that you're necessarily, in the online world at least, people are not terribly brand loyal all the time with their ideas. It's very meritocratic. I mean, if you have something good, people come to look at that, and if you don't have something good the following day, they don't come. And you might be more likely to go to one blog because you went to another one that day. And so are you really competing with the other guy in the same way that we would traditionally think of competition? I'm not sure. I suppose that you only have so much time in your day, so you can literally only read so many blog posts in a day. But it's not... I think that generally there's a... there are some businesses where you work with your competitors, and it's almost, it's almost a little bit like that. And hopefully it lasts well beyond the Obama era. We could use a lot more quality conservative coverage of things that is, careful, well-researched, fact-checked, doesn't make careless assertions or say things just to get people roused up, but that where things are thought through a little bit more carefully.
I think, yeah. Obviously, modeling your newsletter on the old Evans Novak report is a big kind of push in that direction. And we've seen a lot of the conservative outlets say, our mission is to be journalists first and conservatives second. And I think that is a direct challenge to a lot of the old mainstream news organizations that obviously conservatives would decry as liberally biased. And the emergence of an impartial but obviously driven by conservatives media ecosystem, I guess we might call it, would be a good thing. Though obviously I know a lot of progressives have ideological problems, let's say, with a lot of the conservative media outlets that have sprung up, like Breitbart and the Daily Caller and places like that. But I do think it's an interesting thing to look at in tandem with the massive decline of newspapers that we've been seeing. There were rumors yesterday that Koch Industries was looking at buying the Tribune Company, which would be an amazing coup for them, I think, even if it's not really something that's going to generate a lot of profits.
Yeah, and newspapers generally don't. I mean, it's a tough space to be in right now because online is eating so much of their lunch in classifieds, and there are 100 different reasons why it's tough to be in newspapers now. But people do need news, and they need original reporting. They need this stuff. And the fact that it's all available online for free might obscure this, but you really do, people are at core willing to pay for it. So, in the newspaper industry, you have to expect kind of a war of attrition where the strongest survive and become profitable. And, obviously, as we've already seen, a lot of papers fold. On the other hand, what they're doing at the Examiner, I think, is awesome. I'm still writing a column there on. Right now, it publishes on Fridays, and I'll be writing in the new Examiner when it launches. And they basically made a conscious decision to get out of the metro local newspaper business and do something that's a little bit more like what the Capitol Hill publications are doing to cover Washington and politics, but from a more conservative perspective. But to be a real news organization, importantly, and I don't know if I would put it the same way, to be journalists first and conservatives second. I think that you could just say you're if you go back a few decades, the people writing the news then would be probably thought of as conservative for the fact that they were just not quite as ridiculously liberal as newsrooms have become now. But it's important that there are a lot of stories out there that a conservative is going to see and a liberal isn't, just because of a kind of mental block of a certain worldview, or an inability to understand why somebody would think this way, or to understand the point of the person who would think that way. Because let's face it, if you're a liberal journalist and 90% of your coworkers are liberal, and the only exposure you have to conservative ideas is some troll on the internet who keeps heckling you on Twitter, you're not going to come away with a very deep understanding of the other side's point of view.
Right.
And so something that happens that clearly suggests a trend that a conservative would spot immediately may not be as obvious for a lot of journalists.
Right. And I actually subscribe to how I think Jon Stewart described the mainstream news. I don't remember when it was, but he said their bias is primarily cosmopolitan and sensationalist. And I think that cosmopolitanism probably broadly correlates with American progressivism, but that's not the reason why we see the liberal bias. It's not because they're liberals. It's because, like you said, they have a certain eye for things. It's not that they say, I have to hide this news story because it's liberal. It's that I don't think other people would care about this news story because I don't care about this news story, right?
Right.
Right. And I think,
no, that's right.
And I think that conservatives obviously would bring a little more diversity in that space, even just saying, no, people will care, we should write about this, we should cover this. And I think it's going to be a very interesting next few years in the online space as some of the newspapers continue to die out and online becomes, well, it already is, but kind of becomes the only source that people are getting their news from at this point.
No, that for a lot of people, I think that's becoming the case.
All right, well, David Freddoso, thanks a lot for joining me today. This has been a lot of fun, and hopefully we can do this again.
Yes, thanks, Kevin. Good to talk to you.
Sure thing. Keep up the good work at Conservative Intel.
Thank you, and keep up the good work at Town Hall.
You got it. Bye-bye.